The mall was busy that afternoon. Bright lights, loud music from stores, and people rushing from one shop to another created a usual lively chaos. In the middle of it all, one figure quietly walked alone. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, her back slightly bent, and her steps slow but steady. What made her stand out wasn't her age, but what she was wearing. She was dressed in an old military uniform, worn out, faded in color, and clearly used for many years. Her boots looked heavy and scuffed. The buttons on her coat were dull, and the patches stitched on her sleeves were hard to read. Most people at the mall were in casual or fashionable clothes. Her appearance was completely different from everyone else around. As she walked past a group of teenagers sitting near a clothing store, one of them noticed her and whispered something. The rest laughed. One of them joked, "Is that a Halloween costume?" Another replied, "Nah, she's probably playing soldier." But the woman heard them. She didn't react. She just kept walking, her eyes straight ahead. She paused outside a shop that sold vintage items. There was a small table set up nearby, covered in military memorabilia, old helmets, medals, badges, and black and white photos. It was part of a temporary veteran appreciation stall. She looked at each item slowly, as if remembering something important. Her eyes stopped on a picture of a field hospital with tents and wounded soldiers. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the edge of the frame. But even then, no words came from her mouth. She just stared quietly. Some adults passed by and stared at her uniform. A middle-aged man walking by with his wife muttered, "Is that even real? That uniform looks like it's from the 80s. His wife replied, "It's probably fake. No one serious wears something like that in public." The woman kept her calm. She didn't explain. She didn't say that the uniform was real and that every scar, every thread, every faded mark had a story behind it. She had no need to prove herself. But still, the judgment in people's eyes followed her like a shadow. The mall was not a place where she expected kindness. The world had changed since the days she wore that uniform in active service. Back then, soldiers were respected. People saluted them, helped them, thanked them. Now many only cared about appearances. To them she looked like someone out of place, maybe someone who didn't belong. She moved toward a bench near the food court and sat down to rest. Her breathing was calm, but her shoulders looked heavy. Not from the weight of the bag she carried, but from memories that seemed to sit silently inside her. A little girl walked past her and stared. Children, unlike adults, are honest without being cruel. She simply looked at the medals on the woman's chest and smiled. The woman smiled back, gently. The girl's mother quickly pulled her away, whispering, "Don't stare, sweetheart." The little girl asked, "But Mommy, is she a hero?" The mother didn't answer. As more people passed, some glanced at her, some ignored her, and some clearly judged her. One teenager tried to take a picture of her quietly with his phone. He giggled as he typed something into a message. The woman noticed, but again said nothing. She had seen worse things in her life, far worse than rude people at a mall. Still, the feeling of being mocked for something that once brought pride was painful. There was a group of young men at a nearby smoothie stall. One of them pointed toward her and laughed. "Looks like she just came out of a war movie." Another said, "Or maybe she found her granddad's uniform and decided to wear it for fun." They didn't care if she heard them. They just found it amusing. One even shouted across the food court, "Hey, soldier, did you lose your army?" A few people chuckled. The woman didn't respond. But for a brief second, her eyes closed, as if she was holding something in. She stood up slowly and walked again, her steps dragging slightly. Her boots made soft, dull sounds on the mall floor. People moved around her without much notice now, as if she was invisible. But every now and then, someone would turn, look her up and down, and make a face. She walked past a group of mannequins dressed in fancy clothes. On one, there was a military-style jacket for sale, clean, stylish, and clearly designed for fashion, not service. A young woman picked it up and posed in front of a mirror, laughing with her friend. The older woman looked at the jacket, then at her own. Hers was real, not fashion, not a trend. It had been through rain, blood, heat, and dust. But nobody here cared about that difference. They only saw something old and worn out. She kept walking, not to shop, not to show off, but maybe to remind herself that she could still stand tall in a world that often forgets its real heroes. She passed by a jewelry shop where the glass was so clear she could see her reflection. She stopped for a moment. Her own face stared. Back at her lined, tired but still firm. Uniform didn't sparkle. Her boots weren't polished. But they were honest. They were hers. Behind her, someone murmured again, "Can't believe they let people like that walk around dressed like that." Another added, "Someone should tell her it's disrespectful to wear that if she's not the real deal."
Oh.
Woman finally turned her head just slightly, not to argue, not to defend, but just to look. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Then she turned back and kept walking. She went back to the table with military items and stood beside an old man, wearing a veteran cap. He looked at her and gave a small nod. It's a silent salute between two people who had been where others hadn't. She nodded back, and for a moment, she wasn't alone. But the moment passed quickly. It had been over 30 minutes since she entered the mall. In that short time, she had heard cruel comments, seen amused glances, and felt the weight of misunderstanding. Still, she stayed calm. Not because she didn't care, but because she had learned long ago that silence can be stronger than shouting, that dignity doesn't need an audience. She reached the far end of the mall where there was a small area set up for a veterans' charity event. A few posters hung on the walls, and a donation box sat on a table. There were some flags, some flyers, and a screen playing old war footage. Out. Most people walked by without stopping. She dropped a small envelope into the donation box. No name, no note, just a quiet gift. Then she stood in front of the video screen, watching silently. In the footage, young soldiers rushed through smoke, carried wounded comrades, and looked into the camera with faces full of fear and strength. The woman watched without blinking. Her eyes reflected memories that no one around her could ever imagine. She had once been there, not in a video, but in real life. She had lived those moments. She had lost friends. She had saved lives. And now, years later, in a crowded mall, all of that was invisible to most people. She stepped away from the screen and began to walk again. Not many noticed her. Not many understood what that uniform really meant. To them, it was just old clothes. To her, it was a part of her soul. But what none of them knew was that in just a few minutes, everything would change. All it would take was one man who actually knew what her faded patch meant, one person who saw past the surface. And when he arrived, everything in the mall would come to a stop. But for now, the woman in the worn uniform walked on, quietly holding onto her past, unaware that the moment of recognition was closer than she thought. She walked slowly through the busy mall, her old boots making quiet sounds against the shiny floor. Her uniform was faded, her medals dull, and her patches looked like they had been sewn on and repaired many times. Still, she walked with quiet pride, but the looks people gave her were not kind. Some stared, some whispered, some laughed. The comments were getting louder, and the respect that once followed people in uniform was nowhere to be found. Near the food court, a group of teenagers leaned against a wall, sipping their drinks. One of them nudged the other and pointed at her. "There she is again," he said loudly. "The army grandma." His friends burst out laughing. "Maybe she's lost," another joked. "Or maybe she escaped from a museum." Oh. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't try to hide their words. Wanted her to hear. They wanted attention. She heard everything but didn't respond. She just kept walking. A lady standing at a makeup stall looked at her with surprise. She whispered to the salesgirl, "What is she doing here in that outfit?" The girl replied, "Maybe she's just trying to get some sympathy. You know, look sad. Get free stuff or something." Both of them laughed. The woman in the uniform stopped near them to glance at a perfume bottle. The lady moved away, pulling her handbag closer. "Better be careful," she said mockingly. "She might be crazy." Again, the woman said nothing. Her face showed no emotion, but deep inside, Each word was like a small cut. She passed a clothing store where two teenage girls were taking selfies. When they saw her, one of them said, "Wait, take a photo with her in the background." They positioned themselves so she appeared in the back of their picture, then laughed after clicking it. "We'll call it Warrior from the Past," one of them said, showing the photo to her friend. The woman noticed but turned away. She had been strong in war zones. She had faced danger. But this kind of cold cruelty was a different kind. Of battle, one she had never trained for. A man with a fancy coat, gold chain, and expensive shoes walked past her. He suddenly stopped and turned back. "Excuse me," he said, smiling sarcastically. "Did you just come from a movie set? Or, is it Veterans Day already?" Before she could reply, he added, "I mean, if you're going to pretend to be in the military, at least iron the uniform." He shook his head and walked away, laughing to himself. She closed her eyes briefly, just for a moment. Maybe to stay. Calm, maybe to stop herself from remembering the friends she had lost, whose uniforms were buried with them. She walked toward the bookstore. Inside, there was a small display of military books and biographies. She paused in front of it, gently, picking up one book about women in war. She looked at the cover for a long time. Security guard standing nearby noticed her. He walked closer, speaking in a low but suspicious voice. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" She shook her head. "No, thank you." He didn't move away, just checking. "No, we've had people come in dressed strangely too. Caused problems before." She looked at him, tired but calm. "Not here to cause problems." He gave her a long look and then stepped away, watching her for a few more seconds before turning back. Outside the store, a young man wearing headphones took one look at her and laughed. "Oh man, you look like my game character's grandma," he said loudly. "You going to battle, soldier?" He pretended to march in a silly way and saluted her with a mocking smile. She didn't react. She had been trained to ignore noise and stay focused. But here, the noise wasn't from guns or sirens. It was from people who didn't understand. She sat down again, this time on a bench near the central fountain. She placed her small bag beside her and stared at the water as it danced in the light. Kids were playing nearby. Their parents looked at her, then looked away quickly, as if unsure whether to feel concerned or uncomfortable. A man walked by and dropped a coin in her lap. She was surprised. He smiled and said, "Get yourself a coffee, ma'am. Hope things get better." He had assumed she was homeless. That coin felt heavier than it was, not because of its weight, but because of the message behind it. She gently placed it back on the bench and stood up again. She walked past a group of young adults, laughing and taking videos for social media. One of them saw her and said, "This is going to go viral, wait. Let me get her in frame." He turned his phone toward her. Another one said, "Maybe she's one of those stolen valor people, pretending to be a hero to get attention." They discussed it openly, searching online for images of stolen valor to compare. One of them approached her and said, "Hey, are you really military? Which branch? What year? Can you prove it?" She looked at him and said quietly, "I don't." "Need to prove anything?" He rolled his eyes. "That's what they all say." He turned away, disappointed that he couldn't catch her making a mistake. Even as all this happened, she kept walking. She visited a small corner where an old flag was hanging above a small plaque that said, "In memory of our fallen heroes." She stood still in front of it. For the first time, she raised her hand and saluted. Not for herself, not for the crowd, but for those who were no longer here. Her eyes grew wet, but no tears fell. She had learned how to hold them back long ago. A janitor sweeping nearby watched her silently. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were kind. He gave a small nod as he continued sweeping. It was the first silent sign of respect she had received. All day, back near the entrance, she passed a few men in military-style jackets, but they were designer clothes, not real uniforms. One of them laughed and said, "Nice costume, Grandma. You trying to steal our style?" Another added, "Careful, old lady. You're going to scare the kids." They were joking, but their words were sharp. She looked at them once, then kept walking, carrying her silent dignity like a heavy metal no one could see. She walked past a mirror again and stopped for a second. She looked at her reflection. She looked older now than she did when she first entered the mall. Maybe not physically, but in spirit, Her face was tired, but her eyes still had that deep strength that only those who've been through war can carry. She brushed some dust off her sleeve and adjusted the patch on her arm. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to her. Every stitch on that patch had a story. Every medal on her chest came with pain, bravery, and sacrifice. But no one in the mall asked about those things. They just saw something old, unusual, and easy to laugh at. They didn't know that this woman had once stood in the middle of war zones, saving lives, risking hers, as she had written letters. To the families of fallen comrades, she had watched friends die in her arms. She had returned home not to applause, but to silence. As she neared the back of the mall, where fewer people walked, she finally stopped. There was a quiet hallway leading to the veterans' event. She stood there for a moment. The noise from the crowd behind her still echoed faintly. The laughter, the whispers, the mocking, all of it had followed her from one end of the mall to the other, but soon all of that would disappear, because someone was coming. Someone who understood what that old worn uniform truly meant, and in just a few minutes, everything would change. She didn't know it yet, but the same people who laughed at her would soon go silent. Some would apologize. Some would feel ashamed. And some might, for the first time, understand what it means to wear a uniform not for show. Not for attention, but for duty, for honor, and for love of country. For now, she just stood in that hallway, still silent and strong. The mall continued buzzing with people. Shoppers moved from store to store. Children ran past holding balloons. Loud announcement about a flash sale echoed through the speakers. But in the middle of all that noise, she stood alone near a hallway, where the veterans' event was quietly set up. Her faded uniform looked even older under the bright white lights. The patch on her sleeve was almost unreadable now. It was an old symbol, and most people didn't recognize it. They saw the fabric, not the history. They saw the age, not the experience. And they judged. But then, something unexpected happened. A tall man in full military uniform walked into the mall. His boots were clean and polished. His uniform was fresh, and decorated with many ribbons and medals. On his shoulder were the signs of high rank. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a brigadier general. As he stepped inside, people turned to look. Some noticed his medals. Others stepped out of his way. His presence carried weight. He walked with the kind of confidence that comes only from leading soldiers through hard times. He had come to the mall for a special veterans fundraiser. His arrival was announced earlier, but most people didn't care or notice. Now, though, everyone's attention slowly started shifting. Some recognized him from military news or public events. A few even took out their phones to secretly take photos of him. As the brigadier general walked through the crowd, something caught his eye. He saw the old woman standing near the hallway. She wasn't looking at him. She was just standing quietly, her hands folded, her back straight despite her age. She didn't expect anyone to notice her. No, most people hadn't. But the general stopped. He stood still and stared at her, his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. He walked slowly toward her, his steps firm but respectful. The crowd watched. They assumed he would correct her, maybe question her like others had done earlier. After all, that's what some people expected from someone in his position. But what happened next changed everything. He walked up to her and stopped just a step away. There was silence between them for a moment. Then, with everyone watching, the brigadier general saluted her. A full, formal, respectful salute. Gasps were heard from the people nearby. Some were confused, some were shocked, some didn't understand what they were seeing. The woman looked up slowly. When she saw who it was, her eyes softened. She didn't return the salute immediately. She looked into his face, searching for something. Recognition. Memory. Then finally, she returned the salutes, simple, quiet, full of strength. The general stepped closer and gently reached out toward her sleeve. He touched the patch on her arm, the one that had been ignored, and laughed it all day. He stared at it for a long time. His lips moved slightly as he read the faded words. He looked up, and his voice, though calm, carried enough strength that people nearby could hear him clearly. This woman, he said slowly, turning slightly toward the growing crowd, belongs to the 41st Combat Medical Unit, one of the most elite and decorated field medical teams in military history. Now, more people turned their heads. Phones went down. Whispers started. The general continued. This patch here, he said, pointing to her sleeve, was worn by medics who served in the toughest combat zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even earlier. These weren't just any medics. They were frontline, under fire, running through bullets to save others. He looked back at the woman. You served in Echo Base, didn't you? He asked gently. 2004, Helmand Province. She nodded quietly. A breath escaped the general's lips. He took a step back, shook his head slightly, and said, I knew it. You were one of them. His voice broke just a little. I was medevaced out in Helmand, May 2004. My medic was... From your unit? Now people were really listening. A man nearby whispered. Wait, what's going on? Another asked. Who is she? The general continued. I never met the medic who saved me. I was unconscious. All I knew was that someone ran into enemy fire, dragged me out, and patched me up while bullets flew overhead. I lived because of that medic. Turned to the crowd. For years I wanted to say thank you, and today I think I finally can. Because I believe it was you. The woman didn't say much. Eyes were full now, not tears of pain, but emotion. The quiet recognition she had waited for so long had finally come. Not from strangers, not from civilians who didn't understand, but from someone who knew exactly what that patch meant. A teenage boy who had mocked her earlier stood nearby, looking stunned. His phone was still in his hand, but he had stopped recording. A woman who had rolled her eyes earlier now looked uncomfortable, her gaze shifting to the floor. The general turned to the crowd again. You all saw her today? You walked past her? Some of you whispered. Some of you laughed. But this woman didn't need your approval. She didn't ask for your attention. She's one of the bravest people in this mall. Maybe the bravest. The woman looked down at the floor for a moment. Maybe to collect herself. Maybe to hide the deep emotion swirling inside. When she looked up again, her expression was calm. I didn't save you, she said gently to the general. But I served with the one who did. Her name was Emily Diaz. We trained together. She was brave. We all were. The general nodded. Then you served beside heroes. That makes you one too. More people had gathered now. A small crowd had formed. Phones were still out, but now they were recording something else entirely. Not to mock, but to remember. To respect, the general asked if he could walk with her. She nodded. And together, they turned toward the veterans' event area. As they walked, people moved aside. Some saluted. Some simply stared in silence. The same woman who had been ignored and insulted just minutes ago was now walking beside a high-ranking officer. Respected, honored, and finally seen for who she truly was. The general whispered something as they walked. I'm sorry no one saw it before, but I see it now. Make sure others do too. She smiled, a small but warm smile. Thank you, she said. That's all I ever wanted, not the attention, just the respect. As they reached the event table, a few older veterans stood up from their chairs. They recognized the patch. They recognized the face. They came forward and hugged her, some with tears in their eyes. It was no longer just a visit to the mall. It was a homecoming. And all it took was one person. One man who read the tag on her sleeve to change everything. The crowd began to clap. Quiet at first, then louder. Standing ovation in the middle of a mall. Not for a celebrity, not for a singer, but for a real hero. One who had been among them the whole time, unnoticed. But now she was no longer invisible in the world around. Her had finally opened its eyes. The moment felt frozen in time. The mall, which had been filled with noise, laughter, gossip, and judgment only minutes ago, now stood quiet. The people who had mocked the woman earlier were now just watching her in silence, unsure of what to do or how to react. Some looked confused. Others looked ashamed. No one knew what to say. And standing in the center of it all was the woman in the worn uniform, now walking beside the Brigadier General who had just saluted her with complete respect. He was not just a soldier, he was a decorated leader. A man with power, with authority, and with a story that connected directly to her past. He had seen the patch on her sleeve, that small, nearly invisible piece of cloth that so many people had ignored or made fun of. That patch held history. It held pain, courage, loss, and victory. And he had recognized it immediately. They walked together toward the table set up for the veterans' fundraiser, and as they walked, more people joined behind them. It was like a quiet procession, not forced, not planned, but natural. People who had been part of the crowd earlier, people who had laughed or pointed, now followed at a distance, unsure if they should approach, but not wanting to turn away either. The Brigadier General turned to her and asked softly, "Do you mind if I share your story?" She hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. He stepped up to a small microphone at the veterans booth, which had been set up to make announcements about the fundraiser. He adjusted the mic and cleared his throat. His voice was calm, steady, but full of meaning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "You've just witnessed something many people never get to see. You've witnessed a true American hero, quiet, humble, and unrecognized until now." People turned toward him. A few children sat down near the booth. A couple of store managers even stepped out of their shops to listen. "This woman," he continued, gesturing toward her, "served as a combat medic in one of the most dangerous war zones we've ever seen. She belonged to the 41st Combat Medical Unitan elite team, known for going into battlefields not to fight but to save. Under bullets, under explosions, under fire, saved lives while risking their own." The woman stood quietly beside him, looking down. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She never asked for it. But this moment was no longer about just her. It was about every medic, every soldier, every forgotten name from her unit. "I met her today," the general continued, "but I've known her work for years. In May 2004, I was shot in Helmand Province. I was unconscious, but I later learned that someone from her unit pulled me to safety and stabilized me while the fighting continued all around. I never knew their name. I never got to say thank you. But today I stand here with someone who served beside that hero, and in my eyes, that makes her a hero too." People were listening now with full attention. The same kids who had tried to take photos earlier were now sitting still. The same teenagers who had whispered and laughed were now silent, their heads lowered. One of them even wiped his eyes without looking up. The general continued, "Let me tell you something else. These old uniforms, the ones with frayed edges and faded colors, they tell more stories than any new one ever could. These medals that look dull, they're real, earned, not bought. Fought for, not given. And the patch on her sleeve, the one so many of you didn't recognize? That patch stands for courage that most people can't even imagine." He turned toward her and said, "What's your name, ma'am?" She spoke softly, but firmly. "Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Allen, retired." And in that moment, her name echoed in the minds of everyone listening. She wasn't just a stranger in old clothes. She wasn't someone pretending or seeking attention. She was Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Allen, a woman who had led soldiers into battle, a woman who had carried wounded men across minefields, a woman who had once used her own body to shield a younger soldier from flying debris. The general smiled. "Thank you for your service, ma'am, and thank you for your strength today." Someone in the crowd began clapping, then another, and then more. Within seconds, the quiet mall was filled with applause. It wasn't loud or forced. It was soft, meaningful, honest. A standing ovation for a woman who had stood alone all her life, but now was being seen, truly seen for the first time. Some veterans in the crowd came forward and saluted her. One man, in a wheelchair, rolled forward and offered her his metal pin. "You deserve this more than I do," he said, with tears in his eyes. She gently declined, but shook his hand with deep respect. A young woman came forward next, her eyes red. "My brother served," she said quietly. "He died in Iraq." I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for everything. Margaret nodded, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She didn't need to speak. Her presence said more than words could. Even people who had earlier insulted her now stood off to the side, not knowing how to apologize. A teenage boy finally stepped forward and said, "I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't know. I'm sorry." She looked at him, smiled softly, and replied, "It's all right. Now you do." The Brigadier General stood beside her and spoke again. "This is the problem," he said. "Our real heroes don't wear capes. They wear old boots. They walk with heavy steps. They carry memories instead of trophies. And two, often we don't even recognize them unless someone tells us. That has to change." He looked at the veterans table and said, "Let's honor them today. Not with money, not with big speeches, but with attention, with listening, with understanding." Store manager came forward with a bouquet of flowers. "This was for the event," she said, "but I think it should go to you." Margaret accepted it with quiet gratitude. Children began to ask questions. "What did you do in the war? Were you scared? Did you help people?" She knelt down and answered them patiently. "Yes, I was scared, but I did it anyway. That's what courage means." Her calm, humble answers touched everyone. A reporter who had arrived to cover the fundraiser had seen the entire scene. She walked up and asked if she could do a story. "Not just about you," she said, "but about your whole unit. People should know." Margaret thought for a moment, then nodded. "Only if you tell it honestly. We weren't perfect. We made mistakes, but we cared. We gave everything we had." The mall no longer felt like a place of judgment. It had turned into something else. A place of learning. A place of reflection. A place where one woman, without saying much, reminded everyone what real honor looked like. Later, as people slowly went back to their shopping, they kept looking back at her. Not with mockery, not with confusion, but with admiration. Some even whispered her name, Lieutenant Colonel Allen, as if saying it made them feel closer to something brave. The Brigadier General walked with her to the exit, where a car was waiting. Before she got in, he saluted her again. "You changed this place today," he said, "and you reminded me why I serve." She smiled. "You reminded me that not everyone forgets." Then she got into the car and left, leaving behind a mall that would never see veterans the same way again, because now, every time someone saw a patch or an old uniform or a medal, they would remember her, and they would think twice before judging again. The mall was slowly returning to normal. People were going back to their shopping, but something had changed. The place didn't feel the same anymore. The laughter was quieter, the music softer, and the people more thoughtful. Those who had witnessed what happened just a little while ago couldn't forget the sight. The woman in the worn uniform, once mocked and judged, had walked out of that mall with her head high, and with the full respect of everyone around her. But the story didn't end there. The woman, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Allen, had left behind something far bigger than her quiet steps. She left behind a reminder, a powerful truth that touched the hearts of everyone who had seen her. Even those who had laughed at her now felt a strange weight inside them, a mix of guilt, shame, and deep respect. They'd seen her as someone weak, someone strange, someone pretending. But now they knew the truth. The teenage boy who had called her Army Grandma sat quietly on a bench with his milkshake in his hand, staring at the ground. His friends were silent too. No one dared to joke anymore. One of them whispered, "We're wrong, man." The boy nodded slowly. "Yeah. We didn't just laugh at some random old lady. We laughed at a war hero." He looked around, and she didn't even shout at us. She didn't insult us back. She just stood there and took it. The group fell silent again, the weight of their behavior sinking in like a stone. Not far from them, the woman who had assumed Margaret was crazy watched the crowd near the veterans' booth. She had her handbag clutched in both hands, her face red with embarrassment. "I judged her," she said quietly to her friend. "I thought she was looking for attention. She saved lives. Real lives." Her friend didn't say anything. She just nodded. Both women walked slowly toward the donation box and placed something inside. It wasn't just money, it was a small way of saying sorry. The security guard who had doubted her stood near the bookstore. his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had been standing earlier. His heart was heavy. He remembered how he had watched her with suspicion, how he had assumed the worst. Now he couldn't stop replaying it in his mind. He wished he could go back and apologize, but she was gone. So instead, he walked to the veterans booth and asked, "Do you know where she went?" "I'd like to thank her properly." The volunteer shook his head. She didn't leave a name or anything. The guard stood there for a while, and quietly saluted the spot where she had stood. Even the store managers had been affected. The woman from the makeup stall, who had laughed with her coworker, now looked down every time someone mentioned Margaret. She had misjudged someone brave, someone kind. The lesson was bitter, but it had been learned. "I'll never assume again," she said quietly to herself. Never. But the most surprising reaction came from the children. The little girl who had asked, "Is she a hero?" kept asking questions. Why didn't anyone clap for her before the man came? She asked her mother. Why did people laugh? Her mother didn't know what to say. She hugged her daughter and whispered, "Sometimes people forget to be kind."
But now we remember.
Soon, a small group of people, young and old, began gathering around the veterans' booth again. This time, they weren't there just for photos or quick glances. They came with real questions. They wanted to know more. Who was she? One asked, "Can we read about her unit? Do you have any photos from their missions?" What did they do in the war? Volunteers were surprised at the interest. They opened old folders, shared names, showed newspaper clippings. People who had never cared about military stories were now eager to learn. The Brigadier General stayed for a while longer. He didn't go back to his office immediately. Instead, he helped the volunteers talk about the importance of medics, especially in combat zones. He told the story again, how Margaret's unit had saved his life, how he had searched for years to thank them. And finally, how fate had brought him to this mall on this very day. Sometimes, he said to a small group of high schoolers listening, heroes walk among us wearing quiet clothes. They don't brag, they don't shout, but their silence is filled with courage. One of the students asked, "Why didn't she tell anyone who she was?" The general smiled. "Because true heroes don't serve for applause. They serve because it's the right thing to do." He left the mall after signing a few flags and taking some respectful photos. But before going, he asked the veterans group to write down Margaret's name in history. More people need to know her story, he said. And not just hers, every silent veteran who walks among us unseen. Within days, the mall had made changes. A large photo of Margaret, taken when she was younger and in uniform, was printed and placed in the veterans section. Beside it was a printed note, in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Allen and the 41st Combat Medical Unit. They didn't ask for recognition. They earned it with every step they took in silence. The donation box filled quickly. Visitors left letters, cards, and even children's drawings. One drawing showed Margaret with a medal and the words, "Real Hero." But while the mall changed, so did the people. The teenage boy who mocked her started volunteering at the veterans booth. Every Saturday he stood there handing out flyers and telling Margaret's story. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because it was the right thing. The makeup stall lady wrote a letter of apology and handed it to the veterans group, asking them to send it to Margaret if they ever found her. "She reminded me that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it just walks quietly, carrying the past." The little girl who had asked about heroes drew another picture. This time, it showed Margaret holding a child's hand. "Thank you for keeping us safe," she wrote in crayon. And Margaret,
Ow.
She never came back to the mall. She didn't need to. Her message had already been left behind, not in her words, but in the way she had stood there, proud and unshaken, even when mocked. She had walked through fire in her past. Few cruel words couldn't touch her spirit. She returned home quietly. A small house with an American flag outside. Inside, she sat in her favorite chair, took off her boots and looked at a photo on the wall, her old unit. The faces of brave women and men who had risked everything. Some were gone, some were still living quietly like her. She smiled softly and whispered, "They finally remembered." And far away, in the mall where she had once walked in silence. People now walked differently. They looked at every old uniform with care. They thought before they laughed. They taught their children to ask questions with kindness. And whenever they passed that photo of her, they didn't see a tired old woman. They saw a warrior, a healer, a hero. And that, more than any medal or award, was the honor she had truly earned.